The Manhattan Project brought together the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century. Physicists, chemists, engineers, all working in secret to build the first atomic bomb. Some of them lived to be almost 100. 2 of them died within days in a lab from the very thing they had built. Here's the real story of how each of them died, their professions, their roles in the project, and exactly what took their lives. Harry Daghlian was a young physicist working in the most dangerous corner of the entire project, criticality testing. His job was to figure out exactly how close you could bring reflective material to a plutonium core before it crossed the line into a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. On the night of August 21, 1945, Daghlian was running this test completely alone, which already broke lab protocol. He was slowly stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium core, checking radiation readings after every single brick. As he moved the final brick into position, his hand slipped slightly, and the neutron counter spiked violently. The core had gone supercritical in front of him. That reflex likely saved the building, but in that split second, his body had already absorbed a massive lethal dose of radiation. He was rushed to the hospital, and what followed was 25 days of his body slowly breaking down. His hands blistered and swelled beyond recognition. His organs began shutting down one by one. He died on September 15, 1945, at just 24 years old, becoming the first fatal victim of a criticality accident in history.
J. Robert Oppenheimer ran the entire scientific side of the Manhattan Project as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, overseeing the team that designed and built the actual bomb. He's remembered today as the father of the atomic bomb, a title he reportedly carried with real discomfort for the rest of his life. After the war, Oppenheimer became one of the loudest voices pushing for international control of nuclear weapons, warning about the arms race he could see coming. That advocacy made him a political target. In 1954, during the height of the Red Scare, a government hearing stripped him of his security clearance over decades-old associations with left-wing political groups, effectively ending his influence in nuclear policy. He spent his remaining years teaching and writing at Princeton, largely cut off from the government work that had defined his career. Oppenheimer was also a lifelong heavy smoker, and in the mid-1960s, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He died on February 18, 1967, at age 62. In a strange historical footnote, the U.S. Department of Energy formally vacated the 1954 decision against him in December 2022, 55 years after his death. Louis Slotin was a Canadian physicist and, by 1946, the most experienced criticality tester at Los Alamos. Colleagues called what he did tickling the dragon's tail. Slotin had performed this exact test dozens of times, using 2 half-spheres of beryllium that he would slowly bring together around the same plutonium core Daghlian had died testing. On May 21, 1946, Slotin was demonstrating the procedure to the scientist who would replace him in front of 7 other colleagues who had gathered to watch. As he lowered the top beryllium shell, the screwdrivers slipped out of position. The 2 halves snapped shut around the core. The room flooded with a flash of blue light, and everyone present felt a wave of heat roll over them. Slotin didn't hesitate. He tore the top shell off the assembly with his bare hand, instantly stopping the reaction and almost certainly saving the lives of the 7 people standing near him, who received far lower doses because of how fast he acted. But Slotin himself had absorbed a catastrophic dose of radiation in that single second. He was hospitalized immediately, and doctors watched helplessly. His radiation poisoning destroyed his body over the following days. His white blood cell count collapsed. His organs failed one after another. He died on May 30, 1946, 9 days after the accident, at age 35.
Enrico Fermi was the Italian physicist who built the world's first nuclear reactor, known as Chicago Pile 1, in a converted squash court under the University of Chicago's football stadium in 1942. Without Fermi proving that a controlled chain reaction was even possible, the entire Manhattan Project might never have gotten off the ground. After the war, he continued teaching and researching in Chicago, mentoring an entire generation of physicists. In 1954, Fermi began experiencing severe stomach pain. Doctors opened him up for exploratory surgery and found advanced stomach cancer that had already spread too far to remove. There was nothing they could do. He went home to spend his final months with his family and died on November 28, 1954, at just 53 years old. Fermi had spent over a decade working directly with radioactive material during an era when almost no protective equipment existed, and many historians consider his cancer a likely consequence of that exposure. Niels Bohr was already a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and one of the founding figures of quantum mechanics when he fled Nazi-occupied Denmark in 1943, escaping by fishing boat to Sweden before making his way to Britain and eventually Los Alamos as part of the British scientific mission. His theoretical contributions to atomic structure had helped make the entire field of nuclear physics possible. After the war, Bohr spent his remaining years campaigning hard for international oversight of nuclear weapons, genuinely alarmed by what he'd seen the technology become. He died of heart failure at his home in Copenhagen on November 18, 1962, at age 77, a peaceful ending for a man who had spent his final 2 decades warning the world about the opposite.
Richard Feynman was one of the youngest scientists at Los Alamos, barely in his mid-20s, working on the theoretical calculations behind the bomb's design. He later became one of the most celebrated physicists in American history, known for his work in quantum electrodynamics, which earned him a share of the 1965 Nobel Prize in Physics. In the early 1980s, doctors discovered a rare form of cancer called liposarcoma in Feynman's abdomen. He underwent multiple major surgeries over the following years to keep it under control, continuing to teach and research in between treatments. By 1988, the cancer had returned aggressively, and Feynman reportedly chose not to undergo another surgery, telling those close to him that he was ready to stop fighting. He died on February 15, 1988, at age 69. Leo Szilard was the Hungarian-born physicist who first conceived of the nuclear chain reaction back in 1933, years before the Manhattan Project even existed. He was also the one who convinced Albert Einstein to co-sign the famous letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, warning that Nazi Germany could be developing an atomic weapon, the letter that effectively launched the entire American bomb program. In the 1950s, Szilard was diagnosed with bladder cancer. In a move that stunned even his colleagues, he designed his own radiation treatment protocol, using his deep understanding of nuclear physics, working closely with his doctors to calculate the exact dosing himself. It worked, and his cancer went into remission. He ultimately died of a heart attack in his sleep on May 30, 1964, at age 69. A quiet ending for a man who had spent his life either warning the world about nuclear weapons or trying to outsmart his own cancer with physics.
Out of everyone who led the Manhattan Project's science, only 2 died as an immediate direct result of the work itself: Daghlian and Slotin, both killed by the same plutonium core less than a year apart. Their deaths are the entire reason nuclear criticality testing is done remotely today. Every other scientist on this list lived long, full lives and died the way most people eventually do: cancer, stroke, heart failure, decades after the war ended. The question historians still argue over is how many of those later cancers, especially the stomach, throat, and blood cancers, trace back to years of unprotected radiation exposure during the project itself.
It's a question that may never fully be answered.